here we are. We're doing something that I find extraordinarily wonderful. And I think what's interesting about working with the addictive personality and specifically choosing to teach classes in this time is because there's a fuckload of suffering going on right now out there. If you're new to me, I do swear, you'll be fine. And there's a lot of suffering going on, not only because a lot of people are using and taking drugs, but a lot of us are also sober or wanting to be clean or wanting to change how we behave. But nonetheless, we get triggered. And when we get triggered, for many of us, it literally is a shit show. So I thought that perhaps as I go through the weeks of this 6-part series, I'd explain a few things on the way. So if you know me, you know I'm also a trauma therapist, and I'm 30 years clean and sober, and I specialize in addiction, self-harming disorders, eating disorders, trauma, all these things. And why do I teach yoga? I teach yoga, and I came to yoga because as a recovering drug addict and alcoholic 25 years ago, I'm 30 years sober, but 25 years ago, I met yoga. Yoga came along into my life and everything changed. And what I began to understand when I really took apart what was happening is that what we think and what we think we feel, we think it's in our head. Most of us, we think it's in our thinking, but actually what we think and what we feel is generally happening in our body. We are actually this extraordinarily complex system with some really brilliant systems within it. So we're made up of a multiplicity of different systems. And when we have an addictive personality, generally we have a history of shame, abuse, and trauma. And generally what that means is that our brain is wired to look for danger. Our brain is wired to look for stress. Our brain is wired to mistrust and to perceive everything is going to cause us a problem. It's going to hurt us. It's going to betray us. It's going to abandon us. Our brain is set up to think like that. So that means that whatever we choose as a safety mechanism, so drugs and alcohol, they're a safety mechanism. Self-harm, eating disorders, they're a safety mechanism. Post-traumatic stress disorder, it's a safety mechanism. Borderline personality disorder, they're all different ways. Anxiety, they're all safety mechanisms, which sounds so dismissive, but it's not. They are absolutely magnificently brilliant systems. And I'm just going to change my view so I see all of you. So I'm having a conversation with you about systems in your body. So you're moving through this world. If you have any issues around anxiety, self-harm, eating disorder, blah, 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 you're presenting yourself to the world as a safety mechanism, as a system that's wired to safety. So I think I mentioned last week, let me check what I talked about last week. Hang on a minute. I talked about the instinctual self-safety mechanism. So I mentioned that briefly, and I touched on the major muscles in the body. So I thought that today, if you understood about the major muscles in the body, so why we do yoga is partly because it affects the hips, the abductors, the psoas muscles, the diaphragm, and the throat, how we express ourselves, how we speak. When we're triggered, not just triggered because we've hit a trauma or a shame, but when we're actually triggered into wanting to use, wanting to act out, our entire body contracts. Everything in our system gets very short. And this is all controlled by a very, very clever system called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is really interesting because the vagus nerve it helps this whole kind of concert of all these systems come together. And the vagus nerve controls how our eyes work, how our ears work, our throat, how we sound. It controls how we breathe, our heart rate. It controls our diaphragm. It controls all of the internal organs of our body. And it basically controls the pelvic floor. So it controls how the body responds to either the thought processes or the threat of danger or the perceived threat of danger, because the threat of danger isn't always real. For most of us, it's perceived. It's not actually real. It's what's going on in our head. And so our body is in a state of hyper-arousal for most of us due to what we're thinking. It's very more complex than I'm making it sound. It's a very magnificent system. But if we want to get into recovery and if we want to change how we behave, one of the things that we need to understand is that we are operating from a system that's basically screaming that it feels unsafe. And so why yoga helps, why I do things like this 6-part series for the addictive nature and addiction recovery, is because actually all we need to do is stretch. So we're going to go into this stretch in a minute. All we actually need to do is stretch, and we can reset the system. And we can reset it back to a neutral place, which sounds really dull, but neutral is magnificent. It's just a weird word. Truth is, we can trigger it back off again in a nanosecond, but we do actually own a system that we can manage ourselves and manipulate. But the truth is, most of us feel like we are suffering beyond endurance. We're playing with suicidalitis. We're constantly being triggered. We're constantly being overwhelmed, and we constantly can't manage how we feel. So yoga is brilliant. So I wanted to give a little bit more awareness today of when you turn up, what you do to me, I mentioned this last week, is you gift me, the teacher, the ability to help you to land into a state of stillness. And that is a magical thing. So the art is, as you begin to understand this, hi Patty, nice to see you. As you begin to understand this, you might begin to think, okay, so the mat, my mat's behind me, the mat is a magical place. So if you think about how much you might have, I mean, I got really triggered today. Something happened this morning, I got really triggered. I've learned I can stop it. But what you might be here because you haven't learned. And it takes time. And my job is to repeat myself 1,000 times. That's my job. But when we begin to work on the mat, and you may already be on your mat, let the mat be the place where you begin to feel, begin to notice, and begin to understand that you can change how you feel without self-harming. You can actually make really amazing decisions for life and health. And I know that some of you know that. I do know that. But actually, it's so easy to forget. And if you think about every time you get on your mat, it's a magical space. And every time you turn up for a class like this, you gift the teacher the ability to give you back to yourself, because you own a system that when you're stressed and anxious, and when your thinking is stressed and anxious, your system is ready to escape. And when your system is ready to escape, everything is contracted, everything is tight, everything is short and fast. It's very unpleasant. It affects how you think, it affects how you feel. It makes you crazy. It makes you want to do stupid things, take risks, hurt yourself, hurt other people. And when you can release it and soften it, you are magically, extraordinarily fabulous and wonderful. I know this because I've been working with recovering drug addicts and alcoholics for 30 years, and I am one myself. And what we're capable of in our high functioning trauma, when we can master the triggers and begin to accept ourselves. So here's the key today. Most of the suffering that we experience comes from how much we hate how we think. The suffering comes from, it's a very difficult thing to understand. The suffering comes from how much you reject how you feel, how much you hate how you feel, how much you hate your body, how much you hate your history, how much you hate your anxiety. You may have a body that isn't perfect. You may have an anxious mind, but how much you hate it multiplies the upset by 10, by 100. Am I being clear? How much you reject yourself and hate yourself and do not accept yourself is the key to how much you suffer. So we're going to do a series which is called, curiously, I Accept Myself. Now, I have to say that I'm 30 years sober, and I have only in the last 10 years begun to accept myself. So I went through 20 years of sobriety, finding it really difficult to accept myself because nobody explained this stuff to me properly. Nobody explained that how much I hated what I was feeling and doing and wanting and needing, and how much I was getting triggered, how much I was rejecting that was magnifying the suffering. And it wasn't until that was made clear, and it wasn't until I began to understand that I could actually begin to accept myself. So I could sit here and I could say, I have all these diagnoses. I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. That means I think and behave when I'm triggered in a very specific way. I know that. So when I see it coming, I can do something about it. When I feel it, I know what's going on. I don't hate it and then allow that to let me behave really badly. So think about your mat as we play today with this series, I Accept Myself. It sounds so simple, but actually it's really profound, and it's really hard to allow yourself to recognize that your brain is wired differently. And if you can learn how to take care of your brain being wired differently, you can get into a really, really amazing recovery.